The boy disappeared on a cold October morning, when the forests of British Columbia were already shedding their last colors and retreating into shades of iron, moss, and shadow. His name was Ethan Walker, 17 years old, a local, born and raised near the edges of the wilderness that tourists admired and locals respected with quiet caution. The forest was not unknown to him. That, perhaps, was the most unsettling part. Ethan left his house just after dawn. The air was sharp enough to sting the lungs, and frost clung to the tall grasses like a thin layer of glass. He told his mother he planned to hike a familiar trail, one he had walked dozens of times before. He carried no tent, no heavy gear, only a backpack, a bottle of water, a phone with half a charge, and the careless confidence of youth. By evening, he did not return. At first, no one panicked. In small Canadian towns near the wild, delays were normal. The forest taught patience, and it punished haste. But as the hours passed, unease began to spread, slow and persistent, like fog creeping through the valleys. When night fell and Ethan's phone went straight to voicemail, concern hardened into fear. Search teams were assembled before sunrise. Volunteers, rangers, and local police combed the trails with practiced efficiency. Dogs traced Ethan's scent to a narrow path branching away from the marked route, leading deeper into an area few hikers willingly entered. They were signs he had been there: scuffed soil, a broken twig, the faint imprint of a boot in damp earth. And then, abruptly, nothing, as if the forest itself had erased him. 3 days later, the case reached Detective Mara Ellison. She stood at the edge of the search perimeter, her breath forming pale clouds in the cold air, eyes fixed on the towering pines ahead. Mara had spent 17 years in law enforcement, most of them dealing with disappearances that others preferred not to think about. Runaways, accidents, misadventures that ended in shallow graves or never ended at all. Forest cases were the worst. Trees did not speak. Ground shifted. Rain rewrote stories overnight. Mara was not from this town, and that made her an outsider. Locals watched her quietly as she reviewed maps, aerial photos, and search logs. She noticed what others had missed, not what was found, but what wasn't. No blood, no torn clothing, no signs of an animal attack, no frantic trail of escape. Ethan had not run. He had not fought. He had simply vanished. The official theory leaned toward exposure, a slip, a fall into an unseen ravine. It was clean, comforting, and statistically acceptable. Mara rejected it almost immediately. She walked the trail herself, noting how the trees thickened unnaturally fast, how sounds seemed to dull the deeper one went. The forest pressed inward, oppressive but deliberate. She imagined a boy stepping off the path, not in fear, but in curiosity or trust. That idea lingered with her longer than she liked. At the last confirmed location, search dogs had circled repeatedly, confused. Their handlers had blamed the wind, the cold, the terrain. Mara knelt and studied the ground. The soil bore faint, overlapping impressions, more than one set of footprints, but time and weather had softened them beyond clarity. Still, one detail refused to leave her thoughts: the direction. Whatever had happened to Ethan, it had not pulled him further into the wilderness. It had led him sideways. Back at the temporary command post, Mara reviewed missing persons cases from nearby provinces. Most were unrelated. A few were disturbing. Young men, remote areas. No bodies recovered, no witnesses, no arrests. Each case, isolated. Together, they formed a pattern too subtle to be obvious and too consistent to ignore. Late that night, alone with a cup of bitter coffee and the hum of portable heaters, Mara paused over one particular report. A disappearance from 7 years earlier. Different town, same forest range, same age, same silence at the end. She leaned back slowly, a familiar weight settling in her chest, the quiet certainty that this was not an accident, and not the forest doing alone. Somewhere beyond the darkness of the trees, someone knew exactly where Ethan Walker was, and that someone was still free. By the 5th day, the forest had learned the rhythm of the searches and grown indifferent to it. Boots pressed into damp earth, radios crackled with clipped updates, dogs strained against their leashes, but the trees remained unmoved, standing tall and inscrutable as they had for centuries. From above, the canopy looked endless, a living ocean of green and shadow, swallowing human effort without acknowledgement. Detective Mara Ellison returned at dawn. She moved more slowly this time, deliberately separating herself from the organized search, while others followed grids and coordinates. Mara followed instinct, guided not by hope, but by experience. Disappearances, she knew, were rarely dramatic. They unfolded quietly, through small decisions that felt insignificant in the moment and irreversible in hindsight. She studied the timeline again. Ethan had left his home at 6:40 a.m. A neighbor's security camera caught him walking toward the trail head at 7:05. At 7:47, his phone briefly connected to a cell tower before losing signal completely. No outgoing messages, no calls for help. The silence between those timestamps bothered her more than anything else. If a boy was lost, truly lost, panic usually followed. Calls were made. Messages were sent. Ethan had done none of that. Mara stopped near a fallen cedar, its massive trunk split by age and rot. The smell of damp wood filled the air. She crouched and examined the ground again, letting her eyes adjust to detail others had overlooked. Beneath a thin layer of leaves, she found something barely visible, a faint drag mark, shallow and inconsistent, as if something heavy had been pulled only for a short distance before being lifted or supported. This was not the work of an animal. Animals were messy. They tore, scattered, destroyed. Whatever had happened here was controlled, purposeful. The official search report mentioned a possible animal presence in the area. Black bears had been sighted weeks earlier, but Mara dismissed it. Bears did not erase footprints. They did not silence phones without breaking them, and they did not leave behind scenes that felt curated. As the morning wore on, she walked deeper into an unmarked area of the forest, where trails blurred into animal paths and then into nothing at all. The air grew colder, heavier. Sound changed here. Even her own breathing seemed absorbed by the trees. She imagined Ethan walking here, not chased, not running, just following. Maybe someone had called out to him, asked for help, pointed somewhere just off the trail. Teenagers, she knew, often trusted too easily, especially those who believed they knew the land. Near a narrow creek, she found the first undeniable human trace, a torn fragment of dark fabric caught on low branches. It was small, insignificant to an untrained eye. To Mara, it was a scream. The fabric matched the jacket Ethan had been wearing. She photographed it carefully, marked the coordinates, and stood still for a long moment, listening. The forest offered no answers, only the faint sound of moving water and the whisper of wind through needles high above. Yet the longer she stood there, the stronger the sensation became that she was not alone. Back at the command post, Mara reviewed older files late into the evening. She expanded her search radius, cross-referencing unsolved disappearances across Western Canada. The pattern sharpened. Always male, always alone, always near forests, never deep within, but close enough to be lured inside. No ransom demands, no witnesses, no bodies. One case, buried under years of dust and administrative indifference, stood out. A boy who had been found alive after 3 weeks, dehydrated, traumatized, and unable to speak coherently. His testimony had been dismissed as confusion caused by exposure. He claimed someone had kept him safe in a place underground. The suspect had never been identified. Mara closed the file slowly, feeling the pieces begin to align into something deeply unsettling. This was not a spontaneous crime. This was not a one-time act of violence. This was a system, a ritual. Someone patient enough to wait, careful enough to clean, and clever enough to remain invisible. Outside, night fell quickly, swallowing the forest once more. Search efforts would pause until morning. Volunteers would go home. Radios would fall silent. But Mara knew the truth now. Ethan Walker was not lost. He was being held. And with every hour that passed, the distance between rescue and recovery grew thinner, dangerously thin. The rain began sometime before dawn, light at first, then steady enough to blur tracks, soften soil, and erase whatever fragile traces the forest had not yet consumed. By the time Mara Ellison returned to the site where the fabric had been found, the ground looked newly born, innocent of memory. The forest had done what it always did best: conceal. She stood beneath a canopy of towering spruce, listening to water drip from branch to branch, and felt the familiar frustration of arriving one step too late. Time was the true enemy in cases like this. Not the suspect, not the terrain. Time, with its quiet persistence, dismantled truth piece by piece. Mara ordered the fragment of fabric sent for analysis, though she already knew what the report would say. Cotton blend, commercial brand, nothing unique enough to trace. Evidence, but not a lead. Still, she logged it carefully, adding it to a growing list of small confirmations that together formed a much darker picture. Back at her temporary office, repurposed ranger station, Mara shifted her focus away from the forest and toward history. She pinned maps to the wall, marking disappearances with red ink. When viewed individually, each case felt tragic but ordinary. When viewed together, they formed a loose arc stretching across provincial borders, following highways, logging routes, and forgotten access roads. The suspect, whoever he was, did not hunt randomly. He selected places where isolation met accessibility. Forest edges, old service roads, areas where someone could vanish without triggering immediate alarm, and he selected victims who fit a narrow profile: young, physically capable, unlikely to be immediately perceived as vulnerable. Boys who would not be missed quickly enough. Boys whose absence could be explained away. Mara found herself staring at one particular cluster of cases near an abandoned mining region, several hundred kilometers north. The disappearances spanned over a decade, spaced just far enough apart to avoid statistical notice. The man behind them, because it was almost certainly a man, understood how systems worked, understood how police departments failed to communicate, understood how silence protected him. She requested old property records, land use permits, anything that indicated long-term occupation near those areas: cabins, storage facilities, underground structures left behind after industrial decline. The list was long and poorly maintained. Perfect cover. Late in the afternoon, a call came in from a forensic analyst. Ethan's phone had been located, not found, but traced. The signal that had briefly connected on the morning of his disappearance had not come from movement deeper into the forest, as initially assumed. It had bounced sideways, briefly connecting to a private signal booster before going dark. Someone had infrastructure out there. Mara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Signal boosters were not common in protected forest land. They were expensive, deliberate installations. Whoever owned it had planned for isolation and for control. She drove out alone to the edge of the marked zone as dusk settled in. The road narrowed into gravel, then dirt, then little more than compressed earth cutting through dense undergrowth. The farther she went, the more she noticed signs of subtle human interference: trees cut to cleanly, paths cleared just enough to be passable, not enough to draw attention. She stopped where the road ended abruptly, swallowed by vegetation. Beyond it, the forest stretched out, quiet and unreadable. Somewhere beneath that silence, something unnatural existed, a space not meant to be there. Mara did not step beyond the tree line. Experience warned her against it. This was not a place to enter without backup, without certainty. Instead, she stood still, observing, letting the unease settle fully into her awareness. This was not a crime of impulse. This was architecture. As she turned back toward her vehicle, her phone vibrated, a message from a neighboring jurisdiction, responding to her earlier inquiry. Attached was an interview transcript she had never seen before. The survivor from 7 years ago had finally spoken again, just weeks before dying of unrelated causes. His final words had been simple, recorded without interpretation. He didn't chase me. He waited, and when I tried to leave, he smiled. Mara locked her phone, her reflection staring back at her from the dark screen. For the first time since the case began, she allowed herself to acknowledge the most dangerous possibility of all. The man who took Ethan Walker was still active, and he had been perfecting his method for years. The town revealed itself slowly to Mara Ellison, not through its people, but through its routines. She spent a full day doing nothing that looked like police work, walking through grocery aisles, sitting in a diner with untouched coffee, observing how faces changed when strangers entered and relaxed when they left. Small towns did not hide secrets well, but they buried them deeply under familiarity. Ethan Walker's disappearance had altered the rhythm here. Conversations lowered when his name surfaced. Doors closed earlier. People glanced toward the forest without realizing they were doing it. Fear did not arrive loudly, it seeped in, subtle and persistent. Mara reviewed employment records, volunteer registries, land use permits. She looked for someone who had been present for years without ever standing out. Someone useful, someone trusted, the kind of man people waved at but never truly saw. Patterns emerged again. Maintenance workers, seasonal contractors, independent suppliers, men who moved between towns without raising suspicion. One name surfaced repeatedly, never central to any case, always peripheral: Thomas Keller. He appeared in records across 3 provinces, sometimes as a temporary forestry consultant, sometimes as a contractor hired to reinforce old structures, sometimes as a quiet resident living off-grid, admired for his self-sufficiency. He owned no registered property near town, but he leased land periodically short-term, renewable, always bordering protected forest areas. Keller had never been questioned in any of the disappearance cases. He had volunteered during searches, delivered supplies, helped build temporary shelters for rescue teams. His presence had been reassuring. That, Mara thought, was the most dangerous kind of camouflage. She studied an old photograph taken during a search operation 8 years earlier. Keller stood at the edge of the frame, hands in his pockets, watching others move with urgent purpose. His expression was neutral, almost gentle. A man content to let chaos unfold around him. Mara requested a background check deeper than the usual databases allowed. What came back was not alarming: no violent crimes, no restraining orders, no formal complaints, just gaps, years unaccounted for, addresses that existed briefly and vanished. A man who had learned how to exist without leaving marks. Late that evening, she drove toward one of Keller's former lease locations. The road was narrow and poorly maintained, used mostly by logging trucks that no longer passed through. Moss crept over discarded signs. The forest thickened, patient and observant. She stopped where records indicated a structure once stood. Nothing remained above ground: no cabin, no shed, no obvious entrance. Yet the land felt wrong, too level, too deliberate. The soil bore faint signs of repeated disturbance, compacted in places that should have been wild. Mara stepped out of her vehicle. The air colder here, heavier. She walked slowly, scanning for irregularities. Her foot brushed against something metallic, hidden beneath leaves. A vent, disguised, rusted but functional. Her pulse quickened. This was not a place meant to be found. She knelt, clearing debris with careful hands. Beneath the vent, the ground dipped almost imperceptibly, forming a slope reinforced with old timber. An entrance, buried by design and patience. Mara straightened abruptly as a sound reached her: an engine, distant but approaching. Headlights cut faintly through the trees behind her, growing brighter. She had not told anyone she was here. As the vehicle slowed nearby, Mara stepped back into the shadows, her eyes fixed on the concealed structure at her feet. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Whoever was arriving knew this place, and if Keller was still using it, she was standing directly above the truth and directly in its path. Mara remained perfectly still as the engine cut off nearby. Silence rushed in to fill the space it left behind, thick and oppressive. She counted her breaths, slow and controlled, listening to the subtle language of movement: the crunch of boots on gravel, the faint clink of metal, the soft exhale of a man unhurried by time. He knew where he was, from her position between 2 massive firs. Mara watched as a tall figure stepped into the clearing. The man moved with familiarity, his posture relaxed, almost domestic, as though he had returned home after a long day. He carried no visible weapon, no flashlight. He did not need one. The forest, it seemed, belonged to him. Thomas Keller. Mara recognized him instantly from the photographs. Up close, there was nothing remarkable about his appearance. Late 40s, perhaps early 50s, withered face, calm eyes, a man built by labor rather than violence. That normality unsettled her more than any visible threat could have. Keller crouched near the concealed vent and brushed away leaves with practiced efficiency. In seconds, the hidden slope was revealed, its entrance yawning quietly at his feet. He paused, listening not to the forest, but to something beneath it. Then he smiled, just slightly, as if reassured. Mara's hand hovered near her holster, though she knew drawing her weapon would be a mistake. She was alone, unannounced, standing on ground that was not meant for witnesses. Protocol screamed at her to retreat, to call for backup, to mark the location and disappear into the trees. Instead, she watched him descend. Keller moved down the slope with ease, disappearing into darkness that swallowed him whole. Moments later, a dull mechanical sound echoed upward, the heavy door sealing itself from below. The forest returned to stillness. Mara did not follow immediately. She waited, forcing herself to remain patient. Time mattered, but survival mattered more. She memorized every detail, the exact angle of the entrance, the pattern of moss, the way the ground dipped unnaturally beneath the leaves. When she finally approached, the air around the opening felt colder, as though the earth itself were exhaling. The reinforced timber was old but solid. Whoever had built this had not intended it to collapse or be temporary. She radioed her location in coded language, careful not to say too much. Signals were unreliable here. She could not risk alerting Keller if he was monitoring anything above ground. After securing a thin line to a nearby tree, a precaution born of long experience, she stepped inside. The passage sloped downward sharply, swallowing natural light within seconds. The smell changed immediately, damp earth layered with something metallic, something chemical, artificial. The walls were reinforced with salvaged materials, old mining supports, industrial panels, even sections of SOUNDP or OOFING. This was no survival shelter. This was a facility. Mara moved slowly, her flashlight revealing narrow corridors branching with unsettling precision. Doors lined the walls, solid, reinforced, each marked with small numbers etched carefully into metal. The order of it all made her stomach tighten. This place had not grown over time. It had been planned. She reached the first open room and stopped. The space was sparse but functional. A bed bolted to the floor, a bucket, a camera mounted high in the corner, its red light glowing softly. On the wall, scratched deep into the surface, were tallies. Dozens of them, some crossed out, some left unfinished. Mara felt the weight of every missing person press down on her at once. A faint sound drifted through the corridor, then movement, a shuffle, a breath that was not her own. She turned the corner sharply and froze. At the end of the corridor, behind a reinforced glass partition, someone stood in dim light, thin, pale, alive. Ethan Walker looked up slowly, his eyes meeting hers with a mixture of fear and disbelief. His lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came out. Before Mara could move toward him, a voice echoed calmly behind her from the darkness she had just come from. "You shouldn't be here." "Detective." She turned. Thomas Keller stood only a few steps away, the door behind him already sealed, his expression unchanged except for a quiet, almost curious disappointment. And in that moment, Mara understood something terrifying. Keller had not been hiding from the world, he had been waiting for her. The air between them felt compressed, as though the underground space itself were listening. Keller did not raise his voice. He did not rush. He stood with his hands relaxed at his sides, occupying the corridor as naturally as if it were an extension of his body. The reinforced door behind him was already sealed, its mechanism silent and final. Mara did not draw her weapon. Instinct told her it would escalate nothing and resolve even less. Keller was not a man driven by impulse. He was driven by structure, control, systems. Violence, if it came, would be measured. Her eyes moved not toward him, but past him. She mapped the corridor automatically. Distance to corners, the placement of cameras, the subtle hum of electricity running through the walls. This place was alive in a way the forest above was not. It breathed with machinery, not wind. Keller watched her assessment with interest. "You found it faster than the others," he said finally, his tone neither proud nor defensive. Merely observational. Mara said nothing. Silence. She knew. Unsettled men like him more than confrontation ever could. He stepped aside just enough to reveal a control panel embedded into the wall. Monitors flickered to life at a touch, multiple angles, multiple rooms. Some were empty, some were not. Each space identical in design, each reduced to function. Keller followed her gaze calmly. "I don't hurt them unless they make it necessary," he said, as if reciting a rule long memorized. "They're safer here than they would be out there, out there." The forest. The lie he had told himself for years. Mara forced herself to look back at Ethan. The boy stood motionless behind the glass, his body thinner than in the photographs, his eyes too old for his age. He did not pound on the barrier. He did not cry out. That absence of desperation was its own form of damage. "How long?" Mara asked quietly. Keller smiled faintly. "Nah," at the question, but at the sound of her voice. "Long enough." He began to walk again, deeper into the structure, confident she would follow. And she did, because leaving was no longer an option, and because every step closer to him was one step closer to understanding how this place worked. They passed rooms filled with supplies, preserved food, medical equipment, water filtration systems. Everything accounted for, everything clean. Keller did not hoard chaos. He curated order. "This started as a shelter," he said, almost conversationally, a response to how fragile people are when they think help is coming. Mara felt a quiet surge of anger, tightly contained. She had heard versions of this justification before. Men who mistook preparation for righteousness, who believed survival gave them moral authority. "You don't take the ones who ask for help," she said. "You take the ones who don't expect danger." Keller stopped walking. Slowly, he turned to her. For the first time, his calm wavered not into rage, but into something colder. "Assessment, they come willingly," he said. "Every one of them." The words lingered. "Wrong and deliberate." Mara understood then. He did not see himself as a captor. He saw himself as a test. Those who followed him failed. Those who resisted did not last. A sharp sound cut through the corridor, a mechanical click, followed by a subtle shift in pressure. Somewhere above them, something had been activated. Keller's eyes flicked briefly toward the ceiling, then back to her. "You should have brought help," he said, not accusingly, almost regretfully. Mara felt the floor vibrate faintly beneath her boots. This place was changing, and whatever Keller had just set in motion was not meant to let anyone leave alive or otherwise. The vibration beneath Mara's feet faded as quietly as it had begun, leaving behind a deeper, more unsettling silence. Keller watched her closely, as though gauging whether she had understood what had just changed. This was not a threat meant to intimidate. It was a reminder this place obeyed him. Mara kept her posture neutral, her breathing steady. Panic, she knew, would be noticed immediately. Keller thrived on imbalance, on the subtle moment when control shifted from logic to fear. "What did you activate?" she asked. Keller did not answer directly. He resumed walking, and again she followed. The corridor narrowed, the ceiling lowering slightly, reinforcing a sense of compression. The air grew warmer here, tinged with the sterile scent of recycled oxygen. This section of the facility was newer, maintained, improved. "You know," he said after a moment, "people misunderstand what it means to survive. They think it's about strength, endurance, luck." He stopped beside another reinforced door and placed his hand flat against it, almost affectionately. "It's about obedience to reality." The door slid open. Inside, the room was larger than the others, wider, with a high ceiling reinforced by steel beams. In the center stood a simple table bolted to the floor. On it lay a collection of items arranged with unsettling care: a map, a compass, a small recorder, and a folded piece of paper. Mara's eyes were drawn to the map immediately. It was detailed, marked with hand-drawn symbols, paths, dead ends, water sources. The forest above, translated into a private language. "You test them," she said. It was not a question. Keller inclined his head slightly. "I prepare them. The forest is honest. It doesn't pretend to care. That's more than I can say for people." Mara felt a chill. This was not imprisonment in his mind. It was education. Indoctrination disguised as rescue. On one wall, a monitor flickered to life, displaying grainy footage. Ethan appeared on the screen, seated alone in a smaller chamber. He held the compass in trembling hands, his gaze fixed downward. He's been here long enough, Keller continued. He's learned the rules. Soon, he'll be ready. Ready for what? Mara asked, though she already sensed the answer. Keller finally looked at her fully then, his eyes sharp and reflective, like glass under pressure. To leave, the word echoed, hollow and cruel. Mara understood. This was the unexpected ending. Keller offered his captives the illusion of freedom, release into the forest, with just enough guidance to believe survival was possible, but never enough to guarantee it. Those who disappeared were not all taken. Some had been sent back into the wild, weakened, disoriented, and alone, and when they failed, the forest took the blame. You watch, Mara said quietly. You don't always retrieve them, Keller smiled. A genuine one this time. No, only the ones who impress me. The recorder on the table began to play on its own, triggered remotely. A calm voice filled the room. Keller's voice. Recorded, instructive, directions, warnings, false reassurances layered with half-truths. Mara felt something tighten in her chest. This was how he stayed invisible. No bodies, no witnesses who could speak clearly. Just stories of men lost to wilderness and bad decisions. Somewhere in the facility, an alarm chimed softly, not urgent, not loud. A signal meant only for one person. Keller glanced at a nearby monitor, then back at Mara. It's time, he said. You'll understand soon enough why none of them ever truly escape. He reached for a control panel, and as the image on the monitor shifted to show a heavy door opening behind Ethan Walker, Mara realized with sudden clarity that Keller was not planning to kill the boy. He was planning to let him go into a forest designed to finish what Keller had started, and Mara was standing far too deep underground to stop it, at least not in time. The door behind Ethan slid open with a sound that was almost gentle, a soft mechanical sigh that suggested mercy where none existed. On the monitor, pale daylight spilled into the narrow chamber, cutting across the boy's thin frame. He flinched at the sudden brightness, shielding his eyes as though the sun itself were a threat. Mara stepped closer to the screen despite herself. Ethan hesitated at the threshold. Weeks underground had altered him in ways that no medical chart could fully describe. His movements were careful now, economical, as if he had learned that energy was something to be rationed. He looked back once, just once, toward the darkness behind him, toward Keller's voice that had guided, instructed, controlled. Then he stepped forward. The door closed behind him. Keller watched with quiet satisfaction, his hands resting loosely at his sides. He'll follow the map, he said. They always do at first. Mara's mind raced. She understood the forest better than most, but Keller understood fear. The map was not a guide to safety. It was a script, one designed to exhaust, confuse, and eventually betray. False water sources, paths that curved back on themselves, directions that made sense only if one believed the person who had drawn them wanted survival. You weakened them first, Mara said, starved them, isolated them, made sure they'd trust you. Keller's expression did not change. Trust is earned through consistency. On another monitor, Ethan moved through dense underbrush, following markings scratched into trees, marks Keller himself had carved over years, subtle enough to look old, natural. The boy stumbled once, caught himself, pressed on. Every step was an act of faith. Mara turned sharply. You know, most of them don't make it. Keller met her gaze evenly. Most people don't. The facility hummed softly around them, alive with systems designed to observe, not intervene. Keller did not chase his victims. He observed them fail. Distance, he believed, absolved him. Mara felt something settle into place inside her, not fear, not anger, but resolve. She had been wrong about one thing. Keller was not careful because he wanted to avoid consequences. He was careful because he wanted to keep watching. She moved suddenly, faster than he expected, not toward him, but toward the control panel. Her hand slammed down on a sequence of switches she had memorized unconsciously, guided by years of experience and instinct. Lights flickered. Alarm shifted tone still quiet, but urgent now, no longer meant for one person alone. Keller reacted instantly, grabbing her arm with surprising strength. His calm cracked at last, revealing something sharp beneath it. "You don't know what you're doing," he said, his voice slow. Mara wrenched free, pain flaring briefly but ignored. "I know exactly what I'm doing." The monitors glitched, then stabilized, now displaying broader feeds. The forest, multiple angles, hidden cameras Keller had never intended anyone else to see, paths, clearings, traps disguised as terrain. And one small, moving figure. Ethan had stopped, on screen. He stood perfectly still, head tilted slightly, as though listening. The map lay discarded at his feet. Mara's breath caught, somehow through instinct, exhaustion, or a final spark of defiance. The boy had realized the truth. He had stopped trusting the path laid out for him. Keller stared at the screen, something like disbelief crossing his face for the first time. "He won't make it without the map," he said, not angry, certain. Mara leaned closer to the monitor, her voice steady but tight. "You taught him how to survive by controlling him," she said. "You never taught him how to choose." On the screen, Ethan turned away from the marked trail, away from Keller's design, and stepped into untouched forest. For the first time in years, Keller was no longer directing the outcome, and far above them, in the vast, indifferent wilderness, the rules were about to change. The facility reacted poorly to chaos. Lights dimmed and brightened in irregular pulses, as if the underground structure itself were struggling to decide which version of reality to accept. Systems designed for observation, not resistance, faltered under conflicting commands. Keller moved with sudden urgency now, shedding the careful patience that had defined him for years. He crossed the room quickly, fingers flying across the control panel, restoring priority feeds, narrowing the world back down to what he could still influence. Mara did not try to stop him. She watched, on the primary monitor. Ethan pushed through brush that tore at his clothes and skin, leaving thin red lines that would sting later. He did not look back again. He did not slow. Whatever insight had struck him, whatever fragile clarity had broken through weeks of manipulation, it had taken hold. He was no longer following. He was deciding. Keller leaned in close to the screen, his breathing shallow, his composure visibly strained. For the first time, he looked like a man losing something essential. Control had been his language, his identity. Without it, he was exposed. "He doesn't know where he's going," Keller muttered, more to himself than to Mara. Mara stepped closer, her reflection overlapping Ethan's image on the screen. "Neither did the others," she said quietly. "The difference is you were still watching." That truth landed harder than accusation ever could. Keller's eyes flicked toward her, then back to the forest feed. He expanded the view, activating cameras further out, devices hidden for years among trees, embedded in rocks, disguised as dead equipment left behind by defunct operations. The scope of it was staggering. He had not simply used the forest, he had colonized it. Ethan's small figure moved through overlapping frames now, growing farther from the underground structure with every step. His pace slowed as exhaustion set in, but he adjusted, resting briefly, listening, choosing paths that made no sense to the map but made sense to instinct. Mara recognized the shift. Survivors always did this eventually. They stopped asking, "Where am I supposed to go?" and started asking, "Where do I not belong?" Keller's jaw tightened. "He won't reach the road," he said. "Not like this." Mara studied the expanded map on the adjacent screen. She saw what Keller saw and what he did not. The cameras ended in places where ownership blurred, where infrastructure thinned, where old assumptions failed. "He doesn't need the road," she said. "He needs someone to see him." She reached for the emergency beacon built into the control panel, a redundancy system meant to summon Keller if something went wrong inside the facility. She repurposed it with a few swift adjustments, redirecting its signal outward. Piggybacking on the same booster Keller had used for years, a pulse rippled through the system. Somewhere above, a signal flared, brief, imperfect, but real. Keller spun toward her, fury flashing across his face. He lunged, but the floor beneath them vibrated again, not his doing this time. The facility's power rerouted automatically, safety protocols engaging without his permission. For the first time, the structure did not obey him. Mara met his gaze steadily. "You built this place to be invisible," she said. "You forgot one thing." "What?" Keller demanded. "Nothing stays hidden forever." On the monitor, Ethan stumbled into a clearing just as dusk began to thin the light. He collapsed to his knees, chest heaving, then forced himself upright again. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, something moved. Not the forest. Human silhouettes. Searchers. Keller stared, frozen, as years of certainty unraveled in seconds. His world had depended on distance, on anonymity, on the belief that no one would ever truly look closely enough. Above ground, someone finally had. And deep below it, Thomas Keller understood too late that the watcher had become the scene. The forest was merciless, but fair. By the time Ethan stumbled into the clearing, the search team was already there. The tall pines seemed apart just enough for the headlights to pierce through, cutting swaths of golden light across fallen leaves and twisted roots. Mara Ellison was among them, moving swiftly through the underbrush, her coat caked with mud and sweat, but her focus absolute. Ethan's legs buckled, but strong hands caught him, steadying him. He gasped, the long weeks underground finally colliding with the reality of open air. Tears streaked dirt and grime from his cheeks, his chest heaving with the desperate rhythm of life. For the first time in weeks, he spoke. Not words, just a trembling exhale of relief. Mara's eyes swept the clearing, alert. Keller's presence had been confined below, but the man's influence lingered like a shadow. She knew the underground facility would not remain hidden for long. There would be evidence. Cameras, paths cleared and reinforced. All of it would trace back to him. She signaled the team. "Check the perimeter," she instructed, "and keep him contained if he tries to surface." Minutes later, Keller emerged calm, composed, the mask of patience slipping only slightly. The forest had betrayed him in the only way it could, visibility. He walked slowly, hands empty, letting the team approach cautiously. No resistance, no panic, only a quiet calculation in his eyes, as though he were still evaluating his options. "You should have stayed below," Mara said, her voice firm but measured. "It's over." Keller smiled faintly, almost politely. "I've always planned for contingencies," he replied. There was no malice in his tone, only an unsettling detachment. Years of observation and control had left him calm in the face of collapse. Ethan sat on the ground, watching. His gaze did not meet Keller's, though Mara knew the boy recognized him instantly. The fear was there, but beneath it something else. Resolve. The forest had given him lessons Keller never intended. He had chosen survival on his own terms. The police cuffed Keller without struggle. He walked quietly, as if escorting himself out of a place he had called home for years. Mara noted the absence of theatrics, the meticulous care with which he avoided leaving fingerprints, the way he did not glance at cameras above ground, the absence of panic in a man whose entire life had been structured around control. Back at the command post, Mara reviewed preliminary intelligence gathered from the facility. Hidden rooms, cameras, false trails, all documented meticulously. It was staggering. An operation perfected over years. And yet, for all his planning, Keller had underestimated one thing: human instinct. Ethan's instinct, Mara's instinct. The truth that some patterns cannot be entirely controlled. Weeks later, the media covered the story the boy rescued, the serial abductions revealed. A man whose carefully concealed world was finally laid bare. Investigators combed Keller's life, uncovering decades of victims whose disappearances had been attributed to misadventure or wilderness accident. Families finally received answers. The forest, long silent, had spoken through those who survived and those who watched closely enough to intervene. Ethan returned home, forever changed. Mara watched him leave the hospital grounds, small and fragile but alive. She knew the forest had tested him, and he had endured not because of Keller, not because of the maps, but because he had chosen to trust himself when no one else could be relied upon. And somewhere deep underground, in the silent facility Keller had built, the monitors remained. But now, instead of a captive audience, there was only emptiness. The carefully constructed world that had kept him invisible and untouchable lay exposed, and the man who had once measured control over life and death learned what every predator eventually discovers: the forest can hide many things, but it cannot hide the truth forever.